Welcome to the Corporate Treasury 101 podcast. This is the second part of our interview with Craig Jeffery from Strategic Treasurer, where we now focus on breaking down what an electronic payment is and what its journey is. Craig founded Strategic Treasurer in 2004 and is the managing partner of the firm. He also is the publisher of CTMfile, a Treasury News Company. He is a fellow podcaster, and you will find the links to the Treasury Update podcast and Open Treasury podcast in the description of the episode. In the episode of today, expect to learn what is an ACH, an automated clearing house, what is a wire, what is a real-time payment, how do all those work, and how much does it cost to execute them. What is the exact journey of an electronic payment from the moment a corporate executes an order to transfer money until it arrives on the beneficiary account? And much more, of course. Craig is honestly impressive. His knowledge around payment is something, and he's quite used to the podcast format with his own podcast, and we therefore enjoyed the conversation a lot. We hope you will like it as well. If that is the case, why not leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app? It helps us a lot, allows us to interview more and more amazing people like Craig, and makes Wissam and I very happy indeed. With all that being said, please welcome Craig Jeffery.
One last term, we love to break down acronyms, Craig. You mentioned RTP.
Oh, yeah.
What that is?
Yeah, real-time payments. That's a faster payment scheme. That's through the clearinghouse. So I'll probably have to tell you what the clearinghouse or TCH is as well.
Yes, indeed.
So,
well, I mean, maybe that's a good way to just overall, Craig. I mean, I'm struggling a little bit because you say so many times like it needs to be processed and it needs to be this and that. Could you just break down overall what an electronic payment actually is and what the various steps are? Because to an end user, it's just I send money gets received. Sometimes sometimes instant, some other times it's 3 to 5 days. I never really know why. What actually is an electronic payment at its core?
electronic payment at its core, I would say it's a value transfer instruction that begins and ends electronically. So it never, there's no physical aspect to it. It's a digital instructions to handle this. And your question is easy to answer and hard to answer, right? At the simplest level, you send an instruction and it goes through, depending on which type of payment you're talking about, its journey, its rail can pass through different places or clearinghouses or networks before it actually settles, before the value is transferred in someone's account. So that's where you get hung up. Once you start to know everything that happens in the cloud, like you said, hey, I send money and they get it. That's great. That's like, I make like phone systems. If you ever looked at how people design phone systems and how they drew them in schematics, it's like there's a call, you have a local PBX, private branch exchange, it goes into the local network, and then they draw this big cloud, and then out pops the other side, the same type of connection to the other person you're talking to. And what is that cloud? That symbolizes all the switches, all the connections, all the protocols that happen, and it sticks out the side. It's kind of like, oh, that's magic. So in the payment side, and this is probably almost impossible for people to follow audibly, but like if I send an ACH payment, who are the parties? I'm sending it to someone else in the US as a company. When I originate that, I have to send it to my bank, and they call it the originating depository financial institution. And so they're a member of the ACH network. And so they put it through, let's say in this case, they're putting it through the Fed, the central bank system, NACHA. So they're putting it through the ACH network. So they're putting it through the ACH network. The transfer moves over and then it settles in the bank's Fed accounts from the bank perspective. And then they post it, the receiving depository financial institution, in other words, Huan Payne's bank, the bank that, let's say my supplier gets the payment into their account. So there's a lot of steps in there, but the other side just knows I got the payment. But how it traverses to get to their account can look differently. I don't know. The other complicating factor here, it's most of the payment systems that the U.S. has, there's separate networks that can handle those. So like for wire transfer, you think of, most countries use the central bank for, payment settlement, payment rails. The U.S. does that too through the Fed. So like the Fed wire system is run by the Fed, but there's another wire system that your bank can use. It's chips. It's part of the clearinghouse. It's a private network. The banks own it. So they don't have to go through the Fed. They can go through their own private network. And same thing on the ACH side. You can use, the ACH network, essentially owned by the Fed, or you can use the clearinghouse. It's a private network. So I don't know if it stems from we're a certain size economy, if we're just so independent, we always want some type of competition. And so we have, two ways of settling ACH, for example, two ways of settling wires. And those are oftentimes decided by the bank unless they give the ability to specify the payment network. So that's why you might want to just draw a big cloud in there instead of all the permutations that could go.
That's perfect. What are those two ways of settling it? The ACH and the wire? You said there is two options every time?
Well, yeah, there's two options. So you can use the ACH network, or you can use the clearinghouse. So both are ACH formats. They both, follow the same type of rules, but one goes through the clearinghouse, which is private and owned by the banks, and the other is through the Fed system. And same thing with, wire transfers. Well, same type of thing you can use the Fed wire system or you use chips. That's also a private network. We used to do that. I don't know if it still exists. It must still exist today. It still exists today with checks. You can settle by presenting your checks to the Fed. Usually it's done by an image, or you can use, the clearinghouse for that. Yeah, I could tell you a story about 9/11 and what that meant for the Fed and all the checks that used to fly across the country on planes. And since no planes could fly, nobody could do the direct presentment. And so they dumped all of the checks at the Federal Reserve Bank, who had to give them availability. But the Fed couldn't get them physically delivered to the other places. So they just sucked it up, to the tune of massive sums of money, right? It's like, oh, this network won't we'll use our failover network, dump it to the Fed.
But so wait, what happened? Has the money been settled in the end or not?
Oh, they had to give, checks aren't instant. So the money doesn't transfer instantly. There was availability schedules, right? Because there's inefficiency. It would take, 1 to 3 days to move across the country and for the payments to be presented. So you have these availability schedules. The Fed offered availability schedules. And this is all historical, so much more historical. So if you dump the checks there to the Fed, they gave you availability 1 day or 2 day availability of funds based on where the check was drawn. But that assumed normal operating conditions, and they just had to honor that as the clearer of checks.
So is that kind of like why there is this secondary system? Because, why would the banks want the Fed involved if they can just do it themselves? Is it just like a fail-safe, and that's why it's still sticking around, or?
Secondary systems they're owned by the banks because they can oftentimes do things more efficient, more quickly. Getting the Fed has to do things for all of the banks. In the U.S., I don't know if there's 6,000 or 7,000 banks in the U.S. I could have queried that. We have less banks all the time, but they do things for every single bank. But many of the bigger banks can get together and say, we clear so many ACH between ourselves. If you look at the $1 trillion banks, we clear so many ACHs between ourselves. The Fed charges this rate. If we pay into this group, we can do it for way less than that. And so they all do that. They'll clear all those items there. And so it's just, it's an efficiency play to set up the private settlement methods, primarily.
Very cool. One step back from that, Craig, why do I need a clearinghouse in the middle in the first place? Like, can't just one bank just send money to the other? What's this intermediary? What's the actual purpose of it?
So certainly you could send money. So how would you send the money? I mean, usually there's these accounts that they maintain at the central bank. And so when they send money to one another, what are they sending? They're not sending physical goods. If they send money, they're sending instructions that say, what I owe you and what you owe me changes. And so if we have accounts with each other, we can do that and just change our individual balances between those on a bilateral basis. Every bank is going to be, let's say, a participant, with the Fed. And so they have accounts with the Federal Reserve. And so they can use those balances as opposed to having running balances with each and every other bank, so that, your balance at the Fed is a easier way to do that than to have balances at every single bank that you would deal business with. I don't know if I got to the core of your question or not.
So the way I understand that then is, if you look at it as an individual transaction, you could perhaps do like one account to the other, but because so many are happening simultaneously, you just kind of like change the owed amount between them. And if the Fed has all these accounts, they can just like settle everything inside the Fed accounts instead of actually transferring money from,
exactly,
JP Morgan to Chase.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's almost like if each bank had an account at the other and they both held money at the other bank and then they were going to be sending money to each other, how would they do that? They could say, we agree on I'm going to move $1,000 out of my account at your bank to this person that someone on my side is paying someone at your bank. And so they take $1,000 out of my account in your bank and move it to Joe Smith or whatever. We move it to that account. And so that's how we pay a customer or a vendor at your institution. And so that would mean that we have accounts with each other.
That will be a massive tree count for banks.
Yeah.
Or splitwise. I don't know which one is the most used in the US, but that's a bit deal.
We wouldn't use that. It's kind of like it's kind of like to the extent of, why don't we do direct phone calls? It's like we have a separate line running between the three of us. It's like if it's just two of us, you run a wire between our houses, and it's like, great, we can talk. Now we got three, so I've got 2 wires, you've got 2 wires, everyone has 2 wires. They add another person now. It's instead of 6, it's now you just keep expanding it. So this is it's just a way of netting and settling that activity more efficiently using the central bank or using the accounts at the clearinghouse.
I like that analogy. That explains it very, very well. Thanks.
Craig, sorry, but you're shooting amazing knowledge at us, so we just make the most of it. Where does SWIFT sit in all this? Where's the link? Is it separate? Is it an order payment trail? Or is it sitting in between, above, as an overlay? Can you help us understand it?
Sure. SWIFT is a standard setting body for like formats. They're also, so they help set up methods of communicating and formats. They're the second of multiple items. I'll just talk about this for context here. Is they're also a messaging network. They support, messages. So there's non-repudiation. Someone can't say, I didn't really send this. I did send this. So it's all the instructions that primarily banks use with each other, but also corporations can send to, banks, so they can initiate payments or receive information. So they're a giant network or a hub. They don't actually settle the money, but they deliver all the messages that are required to settle all the money. So it's kind of like communication. Like, even though if I send instructions to SWIFT to my bank to move money from here to there, the message tells my bank to move it. And the bank's like, okay, I'm moving this via Fedwire. I'm moving this via chips. I'm using this via taps in the UK, whatever. It tells you, it gives instructions to the bank how to move it, or the bank decides how to move it for them. So the execution is on some actual payment rail, but the messaging network is very, very commonly SWIFT for many, many companies. In the US, people do use SWIFT for payments in the US as a messaging. They tend to do it less frequently. They tend to go, directly to the bank and say, use this Fedwire. They'll send a Fedwire format, or they'll send the ACH format or some other instruction.
Super clear. So SWIFT is the messenger. and the clearinghouse will help the settlement. Okay.
Yeah. So for example, like if there's sanctions going on and someone gets cut out of SWIFT, that means they can't send messages, and it's like you can't communicate, right? You can't communicate. That doesn't stop the settlement, the actual settlement rails, but it stops how people communicate about things. So it's pretty essential for moving money. And banks communicate with each other through SWIFT very, very heavily on a global basis.
Super clear. Okay. Back to those ACHs. I'm really curious to understand it better. So we have an understanding of what it is and how it works, but if we get a little bit into the nitty-gritty details, like what is actually the processing time of a payment executed through ACH? You mentioned earlier the cost. What's the cost of an ACH? Is it cheaper than other, like a wire, for instance, or RTP?
Yes.
And so on?
It's really cheap. Yeah. So in normal, very moderate volumes, it might cost a dime or 25 cents, 10 to 25 cents. Really high volume activity, it gets driven way below a dime. It becomes very, very inexpensive to move that. It's a batch system. So the time frame is, generally it's overnight. So you can send instructions now, and you say the settlement date will be tomorrow, the settlement date will be next Monday or Tuesday, and the settlement date will trigger when the funds move. But the normal ACH, the regular ACHs since 1974 are always, next banking day or beyond. Now, same day ACH, which started in 2016, allows, within given windows, this batch process. This batch process still works, but they incremented additional windows. So instead of just waiting for overnight, they have other windows that they can process and settle the same day. Those are, banks obviously charge a little bit more for those because there's a separate speedy cycle and different process. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned the limit earlier. What was it again? Is it 1 billion is the maximum amount you can use? No. What was it again?
So on a single ACH, the record, the field can handle up to, what is it? It's just below 100 million. So it has enough records for 6, 7, 8, 9. I don't know if there's a period in it or not. Might be 11 characters or 12 with a decimal point. So it's probably 12 with a decimal point. So that's the limit there. On a same day ACH, though, the limit is capped at 1 million. Usually due to speed and the concerns on fraud. So just like most quicker payment schemes, they start low and they keep increasing. So I think that's the third level they're at. I think it started at 25. I think it started at 25,000, moved up.
Is there a difference between an ACH transfer and like a wire transfer?
Yeah. So two things. There's a revocable part of an ACH transfer. Though if there's a fraud or an error, there's a certain amount of time that a company or a consumer can respond. So if there's an error, maybe I was they were debiting my account for the gym membership, and I canceled it, but they kept debiting it. So there's a period of time I can revoke those and say these are unauthorized. So ACHs have a revocable time period. It's extremely limited on the corporate side, whereas wire transfers are irrevocable. You can't force it back through the payment system once a wire's gone. You can ask for it, and you might have to go a legal route to get it back. So those are two of the differences. The cost is different. Think of wires as wires are oftentimes $10 to $25. If you do really high volume, it dips quite a bit below that, but it's a more expensive process. And the transfers, once they're approved, are essentially immediate, but they have to be approved by the bank, and so that will take a little bit of time usually.
How much time do you have to revoke a payment like this then? Like what's the window? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour?
For a wire?
Yeah.
None.
For an ACH then?
But for an ACH, usually it's I can't remember the exact rules, but like on a consumer, usually you have enough time for when you get your bank statement at the end of the month. You have quite a bit of time. On the bank side, you want to be checking your accounts every day because the window is really short. You do not have a week. it's like you want to do it every single day because based on the cutoff, I think it's about 2 days is the max. And so you want to check every day to make sure you get the window if there's a problem.
So is that driven by the mechanism of a wire? So do they not have
rules? It's driven by the rules.
So so does a wire transfer between two bank accounts also have a central, like, common entity that's settling them, or is it like a direct transfer? What's the process difference between a wire and an ACH transfer?
The ACH is batch, so you're sending in a file. Let's say you're paying 1,000 employees, so there's a single file that goes in that has credits to 1,000 employees, and it has an offset to your account. So your account will be reduced by the amount of payroll, and then all those individual amounts will eventually make their way to the end consumer. So that batch goes to your bank, and they submit it through, let's say, in this case, Nacha, and then they will deliver that to the ACH network. They'll deliver all that settlement information to the banks of those 1,000 people. The Fedwire is an individual transfer. And so you send it, and let's say they decide they're going to send it through the chip system, or Fedwire, so that you send a single instruction, gets approved, it gets transmitted to the Fed system, and it settles between the two accounts that the banks of the sender and the receiver have. And then the receiving bank takes the funds that they received and posts it to the recipient's individual bank account. So they handle it for them. So that's really a quick process for the settlement there.
Because it's done on like individual account by account basis and not like as a batch process.
Yeah, it's much more real time. The stuff's processing constantly, so it's moving as quickly as they can. Once it hits the thresholds that it's approved, and the bank submits it into the Fedwire system or into chips, it goes extremely quickly.
Okay, and is there a similar field limit on the wire system?
I don't know that I haven't been so close to looking at formats on Fedwires for quite a few years, but I do remember some banks had limits, like you couldn't do, you could do up to $1 billion per wire. And so you'd have to do, like, if you had to do a $4 billion wire, you might have to use 4 or 5 transfers. I don't think that's a Fedwire limit, but that's something that could be looked up. I don't know on that.
That's okay. Don't worry. No worries at all. Okay, so, and you would choose to do a wire over an ACH because of the nature of wanting an individual transfer? Like, because if it's more expensive, but it's probably quicker, it's just based on your need?
It might be based on contractual requirements. Like when we settle this, or our bond payments, our bond interest payments, the recipient's like, you got to do those by wires. I don't want them called back if there's a concern about bankruptcy or some dispute. So they're usually driven by contracts, but it's contracts and then driven by the need for something to be irrevocable, something that can't be returned.
And they always go through the Fed network, or do banks also have their own private networks?
So it can go, wires can go through the Fedwire system or through the clearinghouse chips system. So those are the two. That's the private one. Private is chips, and the federal system, central bank system, is Fedwire.
Is chips like chip and pin chips or fish and chips? What kind of chips?
It's like fish chips, and then it's a word that sounds the same. No, it's I think it's, yeah. You're breaking me on the definitions. We get used to these acronyms. Yeah. Forget it. It's like it's
Corporate Treasury 101, Craig. 101.
You're breaking me. I should have put those down there. It's like
so Google says clearinghouse interbank payment system.
That sounds good. I knew the clearinghouse part,
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So it's maybe it's not like the fish and chips.
Like fish and chips. Actually, just a little bit hungry. So, Craig, if wires are so instant, you just need the bank like approval to go ahead with it. What's a RTP then? You said it was a real-time payment. Like, there's something faster than instant? How does that work?
Well, the wire transfer system and the ACH network. Those are quite old systems. They're over 40 years old. So they're designed with technology that works a certain way. RTP is essentially instant in terms of delivery. And while the limit's $1 million, it costs about a nickel to use that system. And so it's really rapid settlement. You can include, some more information about the payment. So it's easier to integrate to. It's more expandable. As a new payment rail, it's new tech, right? So, it's like, we're talking about payment systems, it's like phones, like they're all phones, they all transfer money, but some are less expensive, some are better. It's like we got a landline phone, we got an old bag phone, we have really old cell flip phones, and we have some of today's smartphones. There's a significant variety of what's out there for payment systems. So RTP is a new system up since 2017. Yeah. So
it's as recent as that.
Yeah.
What's different in the mechanism behind it that enables it to be faster?
Well, it's a payment system. I just call it like a payment network or payment platform, which operates. I'm trying to think of how I would say this. I'm not an expert on how it all operates, but the newer tech, when I think about payments, how payments are made, it's like there can be greater visibility. You can put more information in there. If you think about things that sit on Azure or Amazon Web Services, you have all kinds of additional capability, function, speed, scalability that is very different from some of the linear approaches that all of the older payment systems took, or most of the transformation that take place in the technology supports the payment process as well. Just like everybody's moving to S/4HANA from an early version of SAP, it's like it's a different type of platform that's not ancient.
Craig, I have my consultant senses tickling. What are the costs of RTP versus wire? I would imagine they are higher than an ACH, right? Because you mentioned that it would be the cheapest option, likely. What are we talking about in terms of cost for wire?
Yeah, they're pretty standard. They're like 4.5 cents. There's a couple other things. So it's pretty cheap. They're around the cost of an ACH. It depends on the volume you're doing. The higher volume you do ACH, you get it down. It can go quite a bit below that, but it's fairly standardized at 4.5 cents. So it's pretty affordable. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Are there any other electronic payment types that we didn't mention that are used in the US?
In July of 2023, the FedNow system is supposed to be live, and that's been confirmed by them. There's a link. Yeah, look at that. The default will be 100K limit, but the physical limit is supposed to be 500,000, and that'll cost 45 cents a transfer. So that's probably a whole nother 101 episode.
Indeed. That sounds expensive though, compared to the 3 other payment methods we just mentioned, 45 cents.
Well, yeah. So what's the total cost of transfers and what you have to do to monitor and track? When you look at the total cost, these newer ones are really, really quite good. When you look at the older systems and what you have to do to communicate, to pass information, to share, to connect to other systems, it's fairly transformative, but that you have to look comprehensively at that. But yeah, 45 cents is 10 times 4.5 cents, of course.
Right.
But depending on what you're trying to do.
Okay. You mentioned quite sometimes batch payments, especially for the ACHs. What are those exactly?
So batch payments as opposed to individual payments. So batch and forward systems, that's like the ACH network. It's like you do payroll or you do AP. It's like, hey, what are we paying today? Here's my payment run. And I'm making these 50 payments or 5,000 payments. I send a single file as a batch. And because it's batch, it can process, in the most efficient manner, not the quickest manner, but the most efficient manner. And that's why it drives the cost down for those. The other, the single entries, the more individual, like a wire transfer, I enter it onto the bank portal. As soon as it's approved, it settles on an individual basis. It settles to your account on an individual basis as well. So if you do a payroll settlement, there'll be a debit to your bank account. That debit will be for the entire amount of payroll in mass. It won't have the 1,000 employees have individual debits. It'll be a single debit for the $1 million.
Yeah. Okay, super clear. So Craig, thanks so much. I feel like, we love getting to the nitty-gritty technical details about how things work. So definitely been super informative in that aspect. Can you bring each of those? So we focused mainly on the ACH, the wire transfers, and the RTPs. Can you bring each of them back to corporate treasury? So as a corporation, if you're paying suppliers, doing payroll, paying your bills, gaining payments from your customers, what are the considerations that a corporate treasurer needs to take when looking at these different payment mechanisms and which ones they want to be focusing on? What's driving those decisions?
Things like the revocability is a concern, the cost, not just the cost from the bank standpoint, but the total cost of the process. And that involves how are we communicating with our trading partners? How are they communicating with us? Every payment is reconciled. Every AP is an AR. Every transfer has a recipient, and they're recording and reconciling those in different systems. So, what information, how rich that information is that travels with the payment matters. So those are some of the considerations. The other, probably more practical considerations are what types of payments types does our formats and types does our payable system manage, our treasury system, our AP system, our admin system. So those are some of the concerns. Like, we can't support 12 payment systems. We've got 3. We want to add a 4th one. So those help drive a lot of those decisions.
And the richness of the information point is quite interesting. Is that just from like a system requirement point of view? Because you just care about like the APs and the ARs? Or is there any other like data that transfers that would be valuable to a corporate treasurer? Like in their ability to understand and optimize their treasury systems? Or is it really just to execute and make sure the machines can talk to each other, that information?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's one is so that it executes and settles properly, so it goes to the right account. But then if you're talking about receivables, they want to assign and apply. They want to assign it to the right, who's paying them, assign it to the right customer, and they need to apply it to the right invoices. And so there can be differences, short pays, changes, errors, whatever. So making it so that the defects that occur to change the amount are fixed or communicated, and so that it's clear what are we paying for. Because if you don't say what you're paying for and they get this payment, what happens is you're no longer electronic. Now you're hyper manually, like someone's calling up and say, what is this payment for? They're sending an email, and there's latency issues of delays of time and following up. So if you really look at the end-to-end process, you want to send enough information so the other party can do whatever they need without having to contact you.
As a receiving end, how do you monitor that? Because for the payments you send, you want as less trouble as possible, I guess. You don't want your suppliers to come back to you, hey, I didn't receive this, or it's not in the correct format whatsoever, having an error message. But when it comes to the payments you receive, so the collections, can you really, on top of, getting money from your client, tell them, hey, look, it needs to be this specific format with this specific information so my system can reconcile properly? Or how does it work here?
Well, since the customer is always right, it's kind of hard to force to include all that information. So they may say, we would like you to send the information included in the addenda records in an ACH, include an EDI BPR segment in the ACH so that our system can automatically apply it on a detail level. Or you have a paying format, you want all of the instructions of what they're paying for to follow the XML format that exists. You can ask that. And banks and, integrated receivables providers and others have a whole process of combining multiple payment types, multiple sources of information that may or may not travel with the payment. So you may have a payment that includes all the information about it, or they may send a payment by itself, and then maybe they email, the information about the 15 invoices they're paying for with the short pays or discounts. So
Yeah.
marrying that information together and then processing it is a good business to be in.